In September of 2016, a farmer named Mark Ellison was halfway through harvesting soybeans on his farm outside Hutchinson, Kansas, when his tractor suddenly stopped moving. The machine was a 2014 John Deere 8320R. Mark had purchased it new 2 years earlier for just over $198,000. At the time of the incident, the tractor had logged 2,740 hours. It had never experienced a mechanical failure. The tractor had been pulling a 36-foot grain cart, moving steadily alongside the combine while unloading soybeans from the hopper. The harvest had been going smoothly that morning. Weather conditions were perfect. The crop moisture was low, and Mark was trying to finish the field before the rain forecasted for the following afternoon. At 2:17 p.m., the tractor's touchscreen display flashed a message Mark had never seen before. Machine function restricted. Contact authorized dealer. The tractor immediately dropped its engine power. The hydraulic system shut down, and the transmission locked itself in neutral. Mark tried restarting the engine. The tractor started, but the warning message remained on the screen. The transmission refused to engage. The machine could not move. The combine operator, Mark's brother Ryan, pulled alongside the tractor and shut down his machine. "What happened?" Ryan asked. Mark pointed to the screen. Ryan read the message twice. Neither of them understood what it meant. The tractor had fuel. The engine ran normally. There were no unusual sounds from the drivetrain. But the machine simply would not move. Mark climbed down from the cab and opened the engine compartment. Everything looked normal. No leaking hoses. No broken belts. Nothing that would normally explain a disabled tractor. After 10 minutes of checking everything he could see, Mark pulled out his phone and called the local John Deere dealership, located about 42 miles away. The call went to the service desk. Mark explained what had happened and read the error message from the screen. The technician on the phone asked for the tractor's serial number and the error code displayed on the monitor. Mark climbed back into the cab and read the code aloud. There was a brief pause on the line. Then the technician said something Mark had never expected to hear about a machine he owned. "That tractor has been remotely restricted by the system," the technician said. Mark frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the machine has entered software lock mode," the technician replied. "Until a certified dealer technician resets the system, the tractor won't operate." Mark looked across the soybean field. The combine sat idle. The grain cart sat half full. Clouds were already building in the western sky. "How long will that take?" Mark asked. The technician hesitated. "Well, someone would have to come out and connect the service laptop." Mark asked when a technician could arrive. The answer was not what he wanted to hear. "Probably tomorrow morning." Mark stared at the screen again. The message still glowed in bright yellow letters. Machine function restricted. The tractor was perfectly functional. The engine ran. The hydraulics were intact. But the machine could not move without dealer authorization. And the harvest clock was still ticking. Mark Ellison spent the next 20 minutes sitting in the cab of the tractor, staring at the warning message on the display. Outside, the soybean field stretched across nearly 120 acres, ready to be harvested. The combine sat idle. The grain cart was still half full. Every minute the machine stayed still meant the harvest was falling further behind schedule. And in Kansas during September, timing mattered. Rain could turn a dry field into mud overnight. Mark called the dealership again. This time he asked to speak directly with the service manager. The man who answered introduced himself as Eric Dawson. Mark explained the situation again. He told Eric about the error message. He told him the tractor had shut down during harvest. He told him the machine was sitting in the middle of a field nearly 40 miles from town. Eric asked for the error code again. Mark read the numbers from the display. There was another pause. Then Eric said something that surprised Mark even more than the first technician had. The system locked the tractor because it detected an unauthorized component replacement. Mark frowned. What component? The hydraulic pressure sensor, Eric said. Mark thought for a moment. 2 weeks earlier, one of the sensors near the hydraulic block had failed during tillage. Instead of waiting several days for the dealership to order the part, Mark had purchased a replacement sensor from a local equipment supplier in town. It had cost $86. He installed it himself in less than 20 minutes. The tractor had run perfectly since then. Until now. You're telling me the tractor shut itself down because I replaced a sensor? Mark asked. Eric's answer was careful. The system flagged the part as non-certified. Mark leaned back in the seat. So how do we fix it? Eric explained the process. A dealership technician would need to drive to the farm. They would connect a service laptop to the tractor's diagnostic port. Then they would verify the replacement part and unlock the machine through the manufacturer's software system. Mark asked the question that mattered most. How much will that cost? Eric didn't hesitate. The service call is $1,150. Mark blinked. That's just to unlock the tractor? Yes. And when can someone get here? Eric checked the service schedule. The dealership had 2 field technicians working that week. Both were already assigned to other repairs. The earliest available time was the following morning. Mark looked back out at the field. The combine operator was still waiting. Clouds were moving slowly across the sky. Weather forecasts predicted rain within the next 36 hours. If the field didn't get harvested before the rain arrived, the moisture content in the soybeans would rise. And when that happened, the grain elevator would start applying penalties. Sometimes several cents per bushel. Over a large harvest, those penalties could add up quickly. Mark asked Eric one more question. Is there any way to unlock it remotely? Eric answered immediately. No. The system required physical access by a certified technician. Mark ended the call. For the next few minutes, he didn't say anything. Ryan climbed down from the combine and walked over to the tractor. What did they say? He asked. Mark pointed to the screen again. They locked it. Ryan read the warning message again. Because of the sensor. Mark nodded. Ryan looked out across the field. So what do we do now? Mark glanced at the darkening clouds moving slowly across the horizon. Then he said something simple. We wait. And waiting during harvest was something no farmer could afford. Mark Ellison and his brother Ryan waited nearly an hour in the field before deciding there was nothing more they could do that afternoon. The tractor still started. The engine still ran smoothly. But the transmission refused to engage. No matter what Mark tried, the machine would not move. The warning message on the screen never disappeared. Machine function restricted. Dealer authorization required. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to change. The bright September sun faded behind a layer of gray clouds moving in from the west. Ryan climbed back into the combine and shut down the engine. The field would have to wait. Mark drove his pickup truck into the field and hooked a chain to the disabled tractor. Slowly, they dragged the 2014 John Deere 8320R back toward the edge of the property. The machine that had cost nearly $200,000 could not move under its own power. Not because of a mechanical failure. Not because of a broken component. But because the tractor's software had decided it was no longer allowed to operate. By evening, the tractor was parked beside the shop building. Mark sat at the kitchen table that night reviewing the weather forecast. Rain was expected sometime the following afternoon. If the rain came before the soybeans were harvested, the moisture content in the crop could jump above acceptable levels. Once that happened, the grain elevator would begin applying moisture discounts. For soybeans, the standard penalty was usually 1% price reduction for every 0.5% of excess moisture. Over the size of Mark's harvest, that could cost thousands of dollars. All because one machine had stopped working in the middle of the field. The dealership technician arrived the next morning at 9:30 a.m. His name was Kevin Miller. Kevin had been working as a field technician for nearly 12 years. He parked his service truck beside the disabled tractor and pulled a rugged black laptop case from the passenger seat. Mark walked over to meet him. Kevin already knew what the problem was before he even opened the tractor's cab. "Software restriction?" he asked. Mark nodded. Kevin climbed into the tractor and connected the laptop to a port beneath the dashboard. Within seconds, the screen filled with diagnostic information. Kevin scrolled through several lines of data before stopping on the system alert. "Unauthorized component detected." Kevin nodded slightly. "Yeah," he said. "That'll do it." Mark stood beside the tractor door, watching the process. Kevin connected the laptop to the dealership server through a cellular hotspot. The unlocking procedure took less than 3 minutes. After the software verification finished, Kevin restarted the tractor. The warning message disappeared. The transmission engaged normally. The tractor moved forward without hesitation. Mark watched silently. The machine had been disabled for nearly 17 hours. The repair itself took less than 5 minutes. Kevin climbed down from the cab and packed his laptop back into the case. Mark asked him the same question he had asked the dealership the day before. "Why does the system shut down the whole tractor for something like that?" Kevin shrugged slightly. "That's just how the manufacturer designed the software." Mark nodded. Kevin handed him the invoice. The total was $1,150. Service call. Software authorization. System reset. Mark wrote the check without arguing. The harvest resumed that afternoon. They finished the soybean field just a few hours before the rain began falling that night. By the following week, the story had already started circulating around town. At the grain elevator. At the co-op. At the small cafe where farmers gathered for breakfast. The story of the tractor that had locked itself in the middle of harvest. And the $1,150 bill required to make it move again. At first, most farmers reacted the same way. They laughed. Technology was complicated. Modern tractors used computers. Problems happened. But as the story spread further across the county, the laughter slowly disappeared. Because farmers began asking themselves a different question. If it could happen to Mark Ellison, what would stop it from happening to them? For the first few weeks after the incident, Mark Ellison didn't talk much about what had happened. The harvest season kept him busy. Soybeans were finished. Corn harvest followed soon after. And like most farmers, Mark spent most of his time focused on getting crops out of the field before winter arrived. But stories in rural communities rarely stay quiet for long. The first place the situation came up was at the grain elevator in Hutchinson. A farmer named Rick Palmer mentioned it while waiting in line to unload soybeans. "Did you hear about Mark's tractor locking up during harvest?" he asked another farmer standing beside the scalehouse. The second farmer shook his head. Rick explained what had happened. The warning message. The disabled transmission. The technician who had to drive out and unlock the machine with a laptop. The $1,150 service bill. At first, the reaction was disbelief. "Wait, the tractor shut itself down?" one man asked. Rick nodded. "Software lock." The farmer leaned against the side of his truck. "So you're telling me if the computer doesn't like something, the machine just stops?" That's what happened. The conversation ended there. But by the next week, the same story was being told somewhere else. At the local co-op. At the parts counter. At a small cafe where farmers gathered before sunrise for breakfast. Each time the story was repeated, the details stayed mostly the same. A farmer. A sensor replacement. A tractor locked by software. And a repair bill to unlock a machine that had never actually broken. The first farmer who made a decision based on that story was David Langford. David farmed 1,200 acres about 15 miles north of Mark's property. He had been buying equipment from the same dealership for nearly 20 years. In early 2017, David was preparing to trade his 2011 John Deere 8235R for a newer tractor. The dealership had already offered him a trade-in estimate. He had even scheduled a visit to look at the new models on the lot. But before signing any paperwork, David called Mark. He asked one simple question. "Did that tractor really lock up on you during harvest?" Mark told him the entire story. The sensor, the software restriction, the technician, the bill. David listened quietly. When Mark finished, David didn't argue or question the details. He simply thanked him for explaining it. 2 weeks later, David traded his tractor at a dealership nearly 80 miles away. Not for another John Deere. For a different brand entirely. The dealership near Hutchinson never heard why he changed his mind. They simply lost the sale. The second farmer who left was Paul Henderson. Paul had purchased 4 machines from the same dealership over the previous 15 years. 2 tractors, 1 combine, and a planter. In March of 2017, Paul's tractor required a routine service inspection. While waiting for the work to finish, he asked the service desk about Mark's tractor incident. The employee behind the counter admitted that the software system could restrict machines when unauthorized components were detected. Paul asked whether farmers were allowed to install replacement parts themselves. The employee explained that modern tractors relied heavily on manufacturer-certified components. Installing parts from outside suppliers could trigger system alerts. Paul nodded politely. He paid for his service and drove home. That spring, when the time came to replace one of his older tractors, Paul made the purchase through a dealership in another county. Within 6 months, 2 longtime customers had quietly moved their business elsewhere. The dealership still didn't recognize the pattern. From their perspective, customers switched brands every year. It was part of the equipment business. But the story about Mark's tractor continued spreading. And each time a farmer heard it, the same question kept appearing in their mind. What would happen if their own machine stopped in the middle of harvest? By the beginning of 2017, the changes at the dealership outside Hutchinson were subtle but noticeable. The service department still operated every morning. Parts orders still arrived on schedule. And tractors continued moving through the repair bays. But something felt different. The waiting area was quieter. The phone rang less often. And several farmers who had once visited the dealership regularly had stopped coming in. At first, the management team assumed the change was temporary. Commodity prices had been unstable for several seasons. Many farmers were delaying equipment purchases. It seemed reasonable to believe the slowdown was tied to the market. But by mid-year, the numbers suggested something else. The dealership's equipment sales for 2016 had reached nearly $5 million. By the end of 2017, those sales had fallen to just under $3.6 million. That kind of drop forced management to start asking questions. The dealership's general manager was a man named Alan Brooks. Alan had managed the location for nearly 10 years. He had built the dealership's reputation around long-term relationships with farmers across 3 counties. So when several familiar customers stopped appearing in the sales records, Alan started reviewing the list more closely. The names were easy to recognize. Farmers who had purchased tractors, combines, and planters from the dealership for decades. Men who had traded equipment every 4 or 5 years. Farmers who normally returned each winter to plan their next purchase. Now they were missing. Alan began making phone calls. The conversations followed the same pattern. He would ask how the season had gone. He would ask whether the farmer was planning any equipment upgrades. And the answer usually sounded polite but distant. "We're good for now. We bought something used this year. Maybe next season." But when Alan checked auction listings and dealer records from nearby counties, he started seeing those same farmers purchasing machines elsewhere. Not necessarily from the same brand, but from other dealerships. In August of 2017, Alan attended a regional farm equipment auction about 60 miles east of Hutchinson. The auction featured several late-model tractors, including 2 machines that had originally been purchased through his dealership. Alan expected strong bidding. Used tractors in good condition usually brought competitive prices. But when the bidding started, the tractors sold for noticeably less than expected. One machine that should have reached $120,000 sold for $94,000. Another that normally would have passed $100,000 barely reached $79,000. After the auction finished, Alan walked over to speak with the auctioneer. "Something seemed off today," Alan said. The auctioneer nodded. "Some buyers are cautious right now." "About what?" Alan asked. The auctioneer shrugged. "Some farmers are nervous about the software systems in newer tractors." Alan didn't need to ask where that concern had started. He had already heard the story circulating through the community. The story about Mark Ellison's tractor locking itself during harvest. When Alan returned to the dealership, he called a meeting with the service department and sales staff. He asked the question directly. What exactly happened with Mark Ellison's machine last fall? The service manager explained the situation. The tractor had detected a non-certified hydraulic sensor. The software had triggered a restriction. The system required dealership authorization to unlock. Alan listened carefully. Then he asked another question. Was the tractor actually damaged? The service manager shook his head. No. Alan leaned back in his chair. So the machine stopped working, even though nothing was broken. The service manager hesitated. That's how the software is designed. Alan nodded slowly. Then he asked one final question. How much did the dealership earn from that service call? The answer came quickly. About $1,150. Alan looked down at the sales reports spread across the conference table. Then he began writing numbers on a notepad. Lost customers. Cancelled equipment trades. Machines purchased from other dealers. By the time he finished calculating the estimates, the number was far larger than anyone expected. The dealership had likely lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in future business. All because one machine had been locked during harvest. And one farmer had told his neighbors what happened. By the spring of 2018, the pattern had become impossible for the dealership to ignore. What began as a single service incident had slowly grown into something much larger. One farmer had switched brands. Then another. Then another. None of them had argued with the dealership. None of them had written complaints. Most of them simply stopped coming in. When the dealership reviewed its customer records, the number surprised everyone. Over the course of 18 months, 12 farms had moved their equipment purchases to other dealers. Some farmers had switched brands completely. Others still owned green tractors but chose to buy them from dealerships much farther away. For the dealership outside Hutchinson, the effect was gradual but noticeable. Trade-in offers that once turned into sales suddenly disappeared. Farmers who normally upgraded machines every few seasons decided to keep their equipment longer. And when they did buy new tractors or combines, the purchases were happening somewhere else. The dealership's sales reports reflected the change clearly. In 2016, equipment sales had reached nearly $5 million. By 2018, that number had fallen below $3 million. The difference represented far more than a single repair bill. It represented relationships that had taken decades to build. Relationships that were now quietly fading away. The dealership's general manager, Alan Brooks, eventually decided to visit Mark Ellison himself. The drive to Mark's farm took less than half an hour. When Alan arrived, Mark was working in his shop preparing equipment for spring planting. Alan introduced himself and explained why he had come. Mark nodded politely. They stood beside the same 2014 John Deere 8320R that had been locked during harvest 2 years earlier. Alan asked the question he had been thinking about for months. Is there anything we could have done differently? Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the tractor for a moment before speaking. It wasn't the money, he said. Alan frowned slightly. The service bill? Mark shook his head. That wasn't the problem. Alan waited. Mark continued. I understand machines break. I understand repairs cost money. He placed his hand on the tractor's tire. But when a machine I own stops working because a computer decides it should, Mark paused. That changes the relationship. Alan understood what he meant. Farmers depended on their equipment. During planting and harvest, a machine wasn't just a tool. It was the difference between finishing a crop on time or losing money. A tractor that could be disabled remotely created a different kind of risk. Not a mechanical risk. A trust risk. Alan thanked Mark for speaking with him. But the conversation confirmed what he already suspected. The dealership could fix service policies. It could update procedures. It could even change how software restrictions were handled. But once farmers began questioning the reliability of that relationship, rebuilding trust became much harder. Over the next several years, the dealership continued operating. Sales stabilized. New customers replaced some of the old ones. But the farms that had already left rarely returned. Mark Ellison continued farming the same land outside Hutchinson. He eventually replaced the 8320R with a different tractor from another manufacturer. Not because the machine had failed again, but because he preferred equipment that he could repair himself. Years later, when someone asked Mark whether he regretted switching brands, he gave a simple answer: no. Then he added something else. A farmer can fix almost any mechanical problem. He looked out across the fields beyond the shop. But when a machine stops working because someone else controls the software? Mark shrugged slightly. There's nothing you can fix about that.